The parade stretched 16 blocks through Manhattan, a river of flags and branded merchandise, moving past barriers that kept the unenhanced at safe distances. Overhead drones tracked every angle. The feed split across 47 channels, each one framing the celebration differently, depending on which demographic algorithm decided what truth looked like today. Martial law had been rebranded as restoration. The deputized supes who'd replaced actual police wore crisp uniforms designed by the same team that handled Vaught's summer collection. Their badges caught sunlight in ways focus groups had approved. Every third float carried a screen showing yesterday's approved crimes being stopped by tomorrow's approved heroes. Ashley Barrett stood on a review platform, her tablet trembling slightly as she monitored 17 separate crisis protocols simultaneously. The new normal required constant adjustments. Behind her, Homelander waved at cameras he could hear clicking from 6 blocks away. His smile calibrated to test well with suburban mothers and military contractors alike. The previous week's polling had suggested more teeth, less squint. He'd complied. The numbers had improved. She'd refreshed the threat assessment screen 14 times. In 3 minutes, a nervous tick disguised as diligence. Every scenario in the database assumed threats that followed recognizable patterns. The models didn't account for variables that arrived without precedent. An influencer named Marcus, 2 million followers, automotive content recently pivoted to patriotic lifestyle. Brand integration held his phone at arm's length, grinning into the forward camera. This is what unity looks like, fam. When we put aside differences and trust the process we get. The sky tore, not metaphorically. The air above Times Square split like fabric caught on broken glass. A vertical wound hemorrhaging light. That wasn't any color the human eye had terminology for. The sound arrived 3 seconds later, a bass frequency that made dental fillings ache and car alarms scream in mechanical sympathy. Marcus kept filming. Training overrode survival instinct. Content was content. The first thing through the rupture was a fist. It connected with the 40-foot LED advertisement for Vought Plus. The streaming service's logo, exploding into sparks and composite shrapnel that rained across the intersection. The figure that followed the punch descended without hurry boots touching asphalt as debris still fell around him. His suit was darker than Superman's, the colors inverted or perhaps corrupted the symbol on his chest, a mockery of hope rendered in charcoal and dried blood tones. Ultraman scanned the crowd with eyes that cataloged weakness rather than threat. His assessment took 4 seconds. When he spoke, his voice carried without effort, bypassing the need for performance. Quaint, a deputized soup-enhanced strength baseline durability, 3 weeks of training launched himself at the intruder. Vaught's crisis manual had 17 pages on unpermitted aerial incursions. He'd memorized 12 of them. Ultraman caught him by the throat mid-flight. The squeeze was brief clinical. Bones didn't just break, they converted to powder. Inside skin that remained temporarily intact. The body hit pavement with the wet percussion of contents no longer properly contained. Ultraman wiped his palm on the dead man's cape, then flicked the residue away with distaste. Compound V derivatives. Interesting. The crowd hadn't started screaming yet. Shock had them locked in place, phones still recording the algorithm, still deciding how to categorize this content. Was it tragedy, spectacle, both? The processing delay meant everyone kept watching. 3 more deputized soups converged from different vectors. Tactical doctrine properly executed. Ultraman studied their approach with the attention someone might give an insect's leg movements under glass. What happened? What happened next took 4 seconds. When it ended, 2 were down, and the third was attempting retreat through a shattered storefront. Ultraman let him go. The lesson didn't require total elimination, just demonstration. Fragile, he observed, addressing no one in particular. The second arrival came as velocity incarnate a crimson streak that stopped mid-intersection in a crouch, one hand touching pavement. Johnny Quick straightened slowly, deliberately, making a show of examining his surroundings. His suit hugged every muscle with indecent precision, the fabric designed for speeds that made conventional textiles ignite. He grinned at the nearest camera. "Miss me." Then he was gone. The deputized soups, still approaching the scene, had 8 seconds to register the blur. When Johnny Quick stopped again, 3 blocks north, eating someone's abandoned hot dog, the tactical formation had been converted to scattered wreckage. The coroner's reports would later classify the deaths as structural failures, mechanical breakdowns, anything except what they actually were. The bodies told a different story, but bodies could be edited before the public saw them. He chewed thoughtfully. New York still does these right. Respect. The third arrival manifested as geometry that shouldn't exist in 3-dimensional space. A dome of sickly green light expanding across Times Square, with the inexorable patience of a glacier. Power ring descended through his own construct, the energy crackling around him like bioelectric discharge from something that had learned to weaponize bioluminescence. His voice carried the flat effect of someone reading terms and conditions aloud. By executive authority vested through dimensional sovereignty, this area is now under protective quarantine. Resistance will be interpreted as voluntary forfeiture of safety privileges. The dome solidified. People pressed against it experimentally then with increasing desperation when they realized the energy barrier didn't yield. Inside the perimeter, roughly 4,000 civilians discovered what captivity looked like when wrapped in the language of protection. Superwoman touched down on the wreckage of the Vought Plus display, one boot resting on the shattered logo. Her armor caught light in ways that suggested both classical sculpture and contemporary munitions design. The lasso at her hip coiled like something alive, patient, waiting for application. She looked directly into Marcus's phone camera. The influencer hadn't stopped recording. Probably couldn't at this point. Shock had converted to autopilot, the only mode available, when reality rejected familiar parameters. "Hello," Superwoman said, her smile sharp enough to draw blood from the conceptual. "We've heard so much about your utopia. We thought we'd participate." The feed didn't cut. Algorithms were still processing, still deciding how to frame this for maximum engagement. Violence performed well. Uncertainty performed better. The intersection of both was unprecedented territory. Homelander finally moved, launching himself from the review platform toward the newcomers. He'd been calculating approach vectors, threat assessments, the precise amount of force that would look decisive without appearing desperate. The math was complex. His landing shook nearby windows, a controlled demonstration of power that photographers would capture from 8 angles. "I don't know who you think you are," he began, voice projected for maximum coverage, "but this is America, and we have..." Ultraman was in front of him before the sentence finished. No dramatic build-up, no power-gathering stance. He simply occupied the space Homelander had been speaking into, close enough that their breath mingled. "You're the one they worship," Ultraman said, not a question. "The God product. The synthetic messiah." He grabbed Homelander by the throat, lifted him 3 feet off the ground, and slammed him into the pavement hard enough to crack the street. Not hard enough to kill that would defeat the purpose. The impact left Homelander conscious, functional, and visibly restrained. Every camera in the area captured it. The algorithm finally decided this was news. Ultraman leaned close, voice dropping to a register only Homelander's enhanced hearing could catch. "We're not here to replace you. We're here to show them what you actually are." He released his grip, stepped back, and Homelander remained on the ground for 3 full seconds before standing. Those 3 seconds would trend for 6 hours. The memes would start in 40 minutes. The crisis communications team would argue about response strategies until someone reminded them that their authority had just been publicly invalidated. The last figure emerged from the rift without fanfare. Owlman simply appeared at street level, his suit absorbing light rather than reflecting it, every line designed for function rather than theater. He didn't address the cameras, the crowd, or his companions. Instead, he walked to the nearest traffic control box, opened it with tools produced from his belt, and began examining the city's infrastructure with the focused attention of someone planning renovations. After 90 seconds of silent analysis, he spoke without looking up. Centralized media control, real-time surveillance integration, population movement tracking via device triangulation. He closed the panel satisfied. You've already built most of the infrastructure we need. Efficient. Ashley's tablet was chiming with 17 different emergency protocols on which had instructions for this scenario. 3 of them had just canceled themselves override commands she didn't recognize coming from infrastructure she didn't know existed. She looked at Homelander, still standing in his impact. Crater costume torn expression somewhere between fury and something that might have been fear if the lighting had been different. The feed was global now. 47 channels had become 400. Every platform, every network, every device capable of displaying moving images showed Times Square and the 5 figures who'd converted celebration into demonstration. Superwoman addressed the cameras again, her voice warm, conversational. The tone of someone sharing wonderful news. We're not invaders. We're collaborators. You've done such interesting work here, building systems of control and calling them freedom. We're simply going to help you finish what you started. Marcus finally stopped recording. His hand had cramped. The phone clattered to pavement, screen cracking, but the feed continued from a dozen other angles. The algorithm had decided this was the story. Everything else was context. Inside Power Ring's dome, people hammered against barriers that didn't acknowledge their existence. Outside emergency services received instructions to stand down, await further orders, maintain perimeter. The instructions came from someone, though later, investigations would fail to identify the source. The chain of command had been compromised before most people realized there was a crisis to command. Owlman tapped a sequence into a device no larger than a hotel keycard. Somewhere in the city, servers began accepting new credentials, granting access to systems that weren't supposed to have outside entry points. He pocketed the device, finally glancing at the crowd, the cameras, the chaos his associates had engineered. Timeline acceptable, he said to no one in particular, his tone suggesting he was confirming a scheduled delivery rather than conquering a city. The rift above Times Square collapsed, sealing itself with the finality of a door being locked from inside. The 5 figures stood amid wreckage and corpses, surveying their new territory with the casual assessment of landlords inspecting recently acquired property. Homelander stood in his crater, fists clenched, trying to formulate a response that would work on camera. The problem was simple. He'd spent years cultivating the image of absolute power. These newcomers had just demonstrated what power looked like when it stopped performing. The feed didn't cut. Someone would eventually kill the transmission, edit the footage, construct a narrative that made sense of chaos. But for now, the world watched Times Square and learned what happened when the performance ended, and something real took the stage. Ashley's tablet went dark, every protocol, simultaneously canceled by an override she didn't have clearance to question. In the sudden silence, she heard Ultraman laugh, a sound utterly without humor. The audio equivalent of watching something break under controlled pressure. Superwoman told the cameras, the crowd, the world, to the next phase of your evolution. The parade had stopped. The flags hung limp. The merchandise nobody was buying anymore would be discounted tomorrow, assuming there was a tomorrow that included commerce as usual. Marcus picked up his phone with shaking hands. The screen was cracked, but functional. His follower count was climbing exponentially, numbers scrolling faster than the display could update. People wanted witnesses. Content was still content, even when content was catastrophe. Especially then. The story had begun, and the cameras were still rolling, because the cameras always rolled. That was what made this world so perfect for what came next. The algorithm had finally decided how to categorize the footage unprecedented. For once, the algorithm was correct. The trending topics updated every 90 seconds. By hour 3, Homelander's name had cycled through 17 different hashtags, none of them controlled by Vought's social media team. The comments section had become an autopsy conducted in real time, dissecting the exact moment America's God had touched pavement and stayed there. Ashley Barrett's morning briefing included 47 separate containment strategies, each one written before someone remembered that containment required control. The recommendations contradicted themselves. Spin it as tactical restraint. Frame it as calculated diplomacy. Suggest the newcomers were allies pending verification. Every option assumed Vought still decided what people believed. The data said otherwise. Engagement metrics showed audiences rewatching the throat grab on loop, slowing it down. Analyzing frame by frame the 3 seconds Homelander spent horizontal. Someone had set it to music. The video had 8 million views before breakfast. Sister Sage stood in the observation room overlooking Vought Tower's main conference hall, watching technicians prepare the space for what corporate communications was calling a partnership summit. The room had been designed to make visitors feel small. Today it would host people who made the architecture irrelevant. "They're not scheduling this," she said to the crisis coordinator hovering near her elbow, a man whose job description included managing optics during superhuman incidents. "We are, which means we're already following their script." "We sent the invitation," the coordinator protested. "Standard diplomatic protocol for they walked into our city without asking. They destroyed public property. They murdered deputized officers on camera." Sage turned from the window, her expression carrying the exhaustion of someone explaining basic arithmetic to a remedial class. "If they're coming to this meeting, it's because they want something from the theater, not from us." The invitation had been Homelander's idea, issued during the 6-hour gap between Times Square and dawn, while he was still deciding whether rage or strategy served him better. The message had been simple, formal discussion, neutral territory cameras present. Proof that he remained the authority figure, extending courtesy to visitors rather than the product that had just demonstrated obsolescence. Crime Syndicate had responded within minutes. The reply contained 3 words. "Tomorrow, your building, noon." No negotiation. No counteroffer. Just acceptance that redefined the terms. Noon arrived with the precision of an execution schedule. Homelander stood at the head of the conference table, flanked by what remained of the 7 after yesterday's reassignments had quietly removed anyone whose presence might complicate the optics. The Deep occupied a seat to his left posture, suggesting he'd been told where to sit, and had complied. A-Train had been positioned near the door, close enough to look included, far enough to run if things deteriorated. Ashley had wanted this meeting closed. Private reconciliation damage control behind soundproofed walls. Homelander had overruled her. The room carried 14 cameras, 5 from networks that had paid premium rates for exclusive positioning. He needed witnesses to whatever came next. Needed America to see him reclaim the narrative, standing up instead of lying in pavement. The door opened without anyone knocking. Ultraman entered first, moving through the space like gravity itself had filed a restraining order and lost. His suit looked darker in indoor lighting, the colors absorbing rather than reflecting a uniform designed to create absence instead of presence. He scanned the room's occupants the way someone might inventory furniture before deciding what to keep. Behind him, Superwoman's heels struck marble with the deliberate rhythm of countdown. Her armor caught the studio lights in ways that made the cameras adjust their exposure automatically. Technology trying to compensate for something that refused to be framed conventionally. She smiled at the nearest lens, then at Homelander. the expressions identical in warmth and sincerity, which meant neither contained any. Power ring manifested without walking, simply existing in the space he designated for himself. A transition so smooth, it suggested he'd been there all along, and everyone else had taken too long to notice. Johnny Quick arrived as afterimage, occupying 3 positions simultaneously. Before settling into the chair he'd chosen, legs kicked up on the table's polished surface. Owlman came last. He didn't sit, didn't acknowledge the seating arrangement at all. Instead, he moved to the wall of windows overlooking the city. Hands clasped behind his back, studying the skyline with the attention of an architect reviewing blueprints. The silence stretched long enough that the network producers started checking their equipment, worried the audio had failed. Finally, Homelander found his voice, the one he used for speeches that had been focus grouped to death. "I think we got off on the wrong foot yesterday. Miscommunication happens during high-stress situations." His smile had tested well with demographics aged 35 to 54. "But we're professionals. We can have a conversation about how to move forward in a way that benefits everyone." Ultraman looked at him the way someone might examine a stain that had started talking. "You want me to apologize?" he said, not quite a question. "For demonstrating reality. For showing your worshippers that you bleed the same as them, just slower. I want," Homelander began voice-acquiring edge, "to establish ground rules for You're still doing it." Ultraman's tone carried the patience of someone correcting a child who kept touching the stove. "Performing. Pretending this is negotiation instead of notification." He glanced at the cameras, then back at Homelander. "They already know. The ratings from yesterday proved it. You're just the last one refusing to update your understanding." The Deep shifted in his seat, the movement drawing Johnny Quick's attention. The speedster grinned, the expression containing too many teeth and not enough humanity. "Fish talker," Johnny said, his voice carrying the manic acceleration of someone who thought faster than he spoke. "That's what they call you, right? I've been wondering, can you hear them screaming underwater when the trawlers come through, or does it just sound like music?" Before the Deep could formulate a response that wouldn't confirm the nightmares, Superwoman cut across the exchange. "Gentlemen," she placed both palms on the table, leaning forward in a pose that would have been calculated if calculation didn't imply effort. "We're not here to terrorize middle management. We're here because Homelander invited us to discuss partnership opportunities." Her gaze found Ashley, who'd pressed herself against the far wall, hoping to avoid notice. "Though I'm curious who wrote that invitation," the phrasing suggested, "someone who still thinks branding can replace substance." Ashley's tablet trembled. She'd been holding it like a shield since the meeting started, scrolling through talking points that were becoming irrelevant in real time. Sage stepped forward from her observation position, drawing attention through the simple act of movement, while everyone else had frozen. "I did," she said, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who'd run the calculations and accepted the outcome. Standard diplomatic framework adapted for cross-dimensional sovereign contact. The language was intentionally formal to establish baseline protocols. Protocols. Owlman spoke without turning from the window, the word arriving like a scalpel finding connective tissue. "You've built an entire civilization on protocols. Procedures for managing disclosure. Frameworks for acceptable casualties. Systems that convert atrocity into quarterly reports." He finally turned his expression, suggesting he'd just completed an inventory and found everything wanting. "You weaponized bureaucracy so effectively, you forgot it was a weapon. We didn't come to disarm you. We came to upgrade the ammunition." Sage met his gaze without flinching, which was either bravery or the understanding that flinching wouldn't matter. "You're here because you want something. Resources, territory, access to infrastructure you can't replicate quickly. Which means negotiation isn't theater, it's necessity, disguised as courtesy." "Smart one." Superwoman's tone managed to make the compliment sound like a diagnosis. "How long have you been covering for him?" She nodded toward Homelander without breaking eye contact with Sage. Doing the actual thinking while he does the actual posing. I provide strategic analysis. Sage replied, each word measured. He provides visual reassurance. Superwoman finished? The appearance of strength in a package demographics find aspirational rather than threatening. You built a god product and spent billions convincing people it wasn't product at all. She straightened, her smile sharpening. We're not here to break your toy. We're here to show you how it works when the safety labels come off. Homelander's jaw tightened. The micro-expression cameras caught, and analysts would later frame by frame, turning it into evidence of something breaking under pressure. He'd been trying to regain control of the conversation since it started. But control required finding an opening, and Superwoman hadn't left any gaps in her delivery. You killed American citizens, he said, abandoning strategy for accusation. Enhanced individuals who were protecting civilians. That's not a demonstration, that's an act of war. War! Ultraman's laugh carried no warmth, just the acoustic shadow of something that had learned to simulate emotion without feeling it. You militarized your police force, turned surveillance into civic duty, and convinced your population that freedom meant choosing which channels showed them the same story. We didn't start a war. We just stopped pretending the existing one was peace. Power Ring finally spoke his voice, maintaining the effectless drone of automated announcements. Threat assessment indicates 73% probability of escalating confrontation within the next 48 hours. Preemptive containment protocols have been established. Civilian casualties are acceptable within margin parameters. Whose parameters? A-Train found his voice, the question escaping before caution could stop it. Power Ring's head turned with mechanical precision. Ours. Which became yours the moment we established operational jurisdiction. You'll receive the full documentation once we've finished filing the paperwork. Your city has excellent forms. Very thorough. The absurdity of it, conquest reduced to administrative procedure, hung in the air like smoke from something burning slowly. Homelander stood the movement sharp enough to make the deep flinch. This meeting is over. You're not partners. You're invaders wearing suits and smiling for cameras while you... Ultraman moved. Not fast, not dramatic. He simply occupied the space between his chair and Homelander, close enough that the cameras couldn't avoid capturing both of them. In the frame, the height difference minimal, but the power differential absolute. Sit down, Ultraman said quietly. You're embarrassing yourself. Again. The silence that followed carried weight, the kind of pressure that made ears pop and vision narrow. Homelander's fists clenched, heat vision threatening at the edges of his eyes. Rage fighting with the calculation that attacking now would be attacking on camera. That losing again would be losing permanently. He sat. The motion took 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds would trend longer than yesterday's footage. Superwoman addressed the cameras directly, her tone shifting to something warm, inclusive, the voice of someone sharing wonderful news with close friends. America has spent decades building infrastructure for control, masquerading as protection. Surveillance they called security, compliance they named freedom. Your previous management was very good at making chains feel like choices. She paused, letting the cameras find their focus. We're simply going to help you be honest about what you've already built. No more pretending, no more performance. Just the truth of what power actually looks like when it stops apologizing for existing. Owlman returned to his window position, hands still clasped, posture suggesting he'd already moved past this room to whatever came after. This wasn't a negotiation. This was orientation. We're not asking permission to operate here. We're informing you of the operational adjustments we'll be implementing. Your cooperation is appreciated, but not required. Sage's tablet had compiled 18 different response scenarios during the meeting. None of them accounted for this, the casual dissolution of authority conducted in front of cameras that would broadcast the whole thing to networks that would run it on loop until something more dramatic replaced it, which meant nothing would replace it. This was the new dramatic. Ashley had stopped scrolling through talking points. Her screen showed social media instead, watching in real time as the narrative rewrote itself. Clips from the meeting were already circulating with new commentary, new framing, new understanding of who controlled the story now. Homelander remained seated face rigid with the effort of maintaining composure while his world reclassified itself around him. He'd spent years building the image of absolute power, and these newcomers had just demonstrated what power looked like when it stopped pretending to need permission. The cameras kept rolling because someone at the network had realized this was history, the kind that required documentation, especially when it was uncomfortable to watch. Johnny Quick yawned, the gesture exaggerated, performative, in ways that mocked Homelander's earlier theatricality. This has been fun, but I'm bored. We done here, or do we need to watch him try to look threatening for another 10 minutes? Ultraman didn't respond to Johnny. He kept his attention on Homelander, the gaze carrying assessment, rather than hostility, evaluation, rather than anger. You're still useful, he said finally. The population needs familiar faces while they adjust to the transition. Keep doing what you do, smile, wave, pretend you matter. We'll let you know when that changes. He turned and walked toward the exit, the dismissal more devastating than any punch. The others followed, powering, dematerializing, rather than walking Superwoman, pausing only to blow a kiss at the nearest camera before departing. Johnny Quick left, as Blur his trajectory calculated to overturn several chairs on his way out disruption for its own sake. Owlman moved last. He stopped at the door, finally looking back at the room's occupants. I've accessed your infrastructure network, he said, conversationally. Impressive work. The integration between private surveillance and government oversight is particularly elegant. Very efficient. His expression suggested professional appreciation rather than threat. We'll keep most of it. Just upgrade the parts that still pretended to serve the public interest. Those were always the weakest links. Then he was gone, and the door closed with the finality of something being locked from the outside. The room remained frozen for 10 seconds before Ashley's tablet began chiming with incoming crisis notifications. The networks were already running the footage, analysts dissecting every moment, social media converting the meeting into shorthand that would define the next news cycle. Homelander stared at his hands, which had remained on the table throughout, fists that had clenched but never struck, power that had existed but hadn't been deployed because deployment would have meant losing worse. Sage was already working through damage control scenarios that she knew wouldn't work, running calculations that kept arriving at the same conclusion the narrative had been taken, and getting it back would require resources Vought didn't possess anymore. The Deep hadn't moved. A-Train had quietly left during Ultraman's exit, his enhanced speed employed for retreat rather than confrontation. Outside the tower, the city continued its normal operations. People going to work, buying coffee, checking their phones, to watch the video. Everyone was watching, learning in real time what happened when the illusion of power met the reality of it. The cameras in the conference room were still recording. Someone would eventually turn them off. But for now they documented the aftermath, the silence that followed conquest, conducted through conversation rather than combat. This was what occupation looked like when it didn't require tanks. Just cameras, and someone who understood that controlling the story meant controlling everything that came after. The trending topics updated again. Homelander's name had acquired new context, new framing, new understanding. The hashtags weren't kind, but they were honest in ways Vought's PR team had spent years preventing. Honesty, it turned out, was contagious. And Crime Syndicate had just infected the entire broadcast. The memorandum arrived at 17 federal agencies, simultaneously time-stamped 4:47 a.m. classification level, requiring biometric verification to access. Department heads opened the document over coffee that went cold while they read. The language was precise, the legal framework airtight, the justification rooted in existing emergency powers that had been sitting dormant in congressional archives since 2003. Subject: operational integration. Protocol: enhanced security coordination authority. Executive order. Classification: redacted. Effective immediate. Nobody could identify who had issued it. The digital signature traced back to a server cluster that existed in documentation, but not in any physical data center anyone could locate. The chain of command had been bypassed so smoothly that questioning it required acknowledging the bypass had occurred, which meant admitting the system had vulnerabilities nobody wanted to name aloud. By noon, Homeland Security had reassigned 3 division chiefs to advisory positions. The replacements arrived with credentials that checked out perfectly. Backgrounds that survived deep scrutiny, references from officials who confirmed their legitimacy without hesitation. One of them was Power Ring, though the paperwork listed him as Director Chen Oversight Specialist with 15 years in infrastructure protection. He sat in meetings without speaking unless asked direct questions. When he did respond, his answers carried the affectless precision of someone reading from approved statements. Nobody noticed that his recommendations always involved more monitoring, tighter restrictions, expanded definitions of threat parameters. The proposals sounded reasonable when framed as enhanced public safety measures. The bureaucracy absorbed him like a transplanted organ the body didn't recognize as foreign. Sister Sage hadn't slept in 36 hours. She stood in Vaught's situation room surrounded by screens showing data streams that kept reporting contradictions. Resource allocations shifting. Personnel transfers executing without her authorization. Legal holds being placed and removed by offices that shouldn't have that jurisdiction. "We're losing administrative control," she said to the room. Though only Ashley was listening, the rest of the crisis team had been replaced over the past 12 hours. Quietly, efficiently. Each reassignment justified by some procedural technicality that existed in manuals nobody had read until yesterday. Ashley clutched her device. Not a tablet anymore. Someone had confiscated that and issued her a new interface with restricted access and tried to make sense of the org chart that had rewritten itself overnight. How is this legal? Everything's legal if you have the right signatures. Sage pulled up a procurement order that had routed $18 million in Vought security contracts to a subsidiary that hadn't existed last week. The company registration traced back to a law firm in Delaware that specialized in shell corporations. They're not stealing. They're inheriting. Because we built the mechanism for them. The door opened. Owlman entered without knocking, carrying a briefcase that looked older than the building. He moved to the primary workstation and connected a drive to the system. The screens flickered, then began displaying file structures that Sage recognized as Vaught's internal architecture, except organized differently, cleaned up, optimized. "You have redundant security protocols," he said without preamble. 17 layers that do the same verification checks but create processing delays. I've streamlined that to 4. He glanced at her. Efficiency gains 43%. You're welcome. Sage didn't move. You can't just access our proprietary systems. I didn't access them. I inherited administrative privileges when your board signed the emergency partnership framework yesterday. He pulled up a document that carried signatures from every voting member. Section 12, subsection E, Technology Integration for Enhanced Operational Security. Your lawyers wrote it. Very thorough. That was for limited consultation. The language says, full access for assessment and optimization purposes. Owlman scrolled through highlighted clauses. Your legal team used standard boilerplate without reading the precedent case law. The phrasing grants blanket authority. I didn't hack anything. You invited me in. Ashley was staring at her device screen, which had just updated with a company-wide announcement. New security chief, appointed reporting structure, modified all personnel to complete updated clearance verification by end of week. The security chief's name was listed as Thomas Wayne Jr. Credentials, impeccable background check, showing 20 years in corporate risk management. Nobody would realize it was Alman until it was too late to matter. Sage ran probability scenarios in her head, each one ending the same way. What do you want? Nothing you weren't already building. He closed his briefcase with a decisive click. You created a surveillance state and called it customer engagement. You weaponized data and called it personalization. You built systems to control information flow and called it content moderation. His expression suggested professional respect rather than condemnation. I'm just removing the pretense. The infrastructure stays, the branding changes. He left without waiting for response, leaving behind a reorganization plan that would execute automatically unless someone with authority stopped it. The problem, everyone with that authority had just been reassigned. 3 blocks away, Superwoman sat across from Janine Carr, host of America's highest-rated morning talk show, the one that shaped national conversation more effectively than any congressional hearing. The lighting was warm, the set designed to feel like a comfortable living room where friends shared coffee and truth. I think what people are responding to. Superwoman set her tone, carrying the practiced ease of someone who'd done 1,000 interviews, is honesty. For too long we've been told that safety requires secrecy, that protection means surveillance, that security demands surrender. She leaned forward slightly, engaging the audience directly. But what if we stopped pretending? What if we acknowledged that these systems exist, that they're necessary, and that transparency makes them stronger, not weaker? Janine nodded, her expression showing the carefully calibrated concern that tested well with focus groups. So, you're saying Crime Syndicate isn't here to take over? We're here to take the mask off what was already there. Superwoman's smile carried warmth that didn't reach her eyes, though the cameras loved it anyway. Your government has had extraordinary powers for decades. Your corporations have been mining your data since before you knew what data was. The only thing we're changing is the honesty about it. In the control booth, the segment producer watched the live feed and made a note: extend this segment by 4 minutes. The audience engagement numbers were spiking. This was the kind of content that drove subscriptions. Nobody noticed that the producer had been replaced 3 hours ago. The new one looked identical, sounded identical, made all the same decisions the old one would have made. Except when it mattered. The segment would run on every affiliate. Clips would circulate on social platforms. By evening, Superwoman's framing would become the dominant narrative, not invasion, but intervention. Not conquest, but collaboration. The boys had moved their operations to a basement that didn't appear on any building schema accessible through a service corridor that maintenance crews had forgotten about after the renovation in 2009. No internet connection, no phones. Communication via dead drops and face-to-face meetings in locations they changed daily. Butcher stood over a table covered in documents they'd compiled, leaked memos, reassignment orders, policy changes. The pattern was clear, even if the mechanism wasn't. They're not smashing the state, he said, voice rough from too much coffee and not enough sleep. They're becoming it. Traced lines between organizational charts, watching how power structures had shifted. How do you fight something that uses the rulebook better than the people who wrote it? Annie sat against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees. She'd spent the morning watching news coverage that had seamlessly incorporated Crime Syndicate into the existing framework. Expert panels discussing integration strategies. Legal scholars debating jurisdiction questions. Think pieces about whether this partnership represented evolution or revolution. They're making it normal, she said quietly. That's the weapon, not fear, acceptance. Huey was monitoring radio chatter from a scanner they'd salvaged, tracking emergency services coordination. Department of Homeland Security just issued a joint statement with someone called Director Chen, expanding threat assessment parameters to include anti-integration activities. He looked up. That's us. They just made resistance to crime syndicate legally equivalent to domestic terrorism. The silence that followed carried weight. This wasn't a fight they knew how to have. Violence solved immediate problems. Take out the target, disrupt the plan, expose the conspiracy. But how did you disrupt something that had already woven itself into every official channel? How did you expose corruption when the corruption rewrote the definition of legitimate authority? Butcher's jaw tightened. Virus still works. On soups, MM countered. Not on paperwork, not on org charts. You want to release it now, you'll kill enhanced individuals and change exactly nothing about who's running the show. In Vought Tower, Homelander stood in what used to be his private conference room. The space looked identical, same furniture, same view, same coffee service. But the security detail outside the door reported to someone else now. The meeting scheduled for this afternoon had been added to his calendar without consultation. His assistant had been reassigned to special projects and replaced by someone who smiled politely and ignored his questions. He was still called the leader, still appeared on promotional materials, still did public appearances, but the requests for his input had stopped arriving. Decisions were made then presented to him as finalized. Ultraman hadn't visited again, didn't need to. His initial demonstration had established the hierarchy. Everything afterward was just implementation. The city outside continued functioning. Trains ran on schedule. Markets stayed open. People went to work, came home, watched television that told them everything was under control. Crime Syndicate hadn't destroyed the machine. They'd just changed who operated it. Alman sat in an office that had belonged to Vought's chief operating officer until this morning. The previous occupant had been offered a generous severance package and a consulting position that required no actual consulting. He'd accepted without protest, relieved to leave with dignity instead of scandal. The desk was clean except for 3 folders: Federal Oversight Integration Media Coordination Protocols and Enhanced Asset Management. Each one represented a pillar of control that had existed before Crime Syndicate arrived. They'd just been distributed across agencies, corporations, and oversight bodies in ways that prevented consolidation. Now they were consolidated. Now they were efficient. He opened the first folder and began reading. The systems were elegant, really. Decades of legal framework designed to concentrate power while maintaining the appearance of checks and balances. All it required was someone willing to use the framework without apology, without pretense that it served anything except control. They'd built a prison nation and called it freedom, constructed surveillance state and named it security, engineered compliance and branded it choice. Crime Syndicate hadn't invaded. They'd just moved into the infrastructure that was already waiting, perfectly designed for exactly this purpose. Sister Sage stood in the now empty Situation Room, watching her access credentials fail one by one as systems locked her out. She'd been brilliant enough to see this coming and powerless to stop it, because every mechanism she might have used to resist had been built with vulnerabilities that assumed the users shared her interests. They didn't, and the system adapted accordingly. Across the city, Power Ring sat in his new office reviewing zoning proposals that would expand monitoring infrastructure into neighborhoods previously considered too residential for surveillance equipment. The proposals were reasonable, the justification sound, the legal precedent established. He approved them with a keystroke. The system executed immediately. Johnny Quick didn't have an office, didn't need one. He appeared in places where his presence caused just enough disruption to remind people that stability was conditional. A blur through a secured facility, a theft from an evidence locker, a traffic accident that couldn't be explained, not chaos. Controlled instability, the kind that made people grateful for order when it returned. Superwoman's interview aired in prime time. The quotes became headlines. The framing became conventional wisdom. By the time fact-checkers raised questions, the narrative had already solidified into consensus. This was how occupation worked. When conquest happened through consent, even coerced consent, even consent manufactured through systems designed to produce it. Owlman closed the last folder and stood looking out over the city that had just transferred ownership without realizing it had been property all along. Efficient, he said to the empty room. Outside, the sun set on the first full day of the new administration. Nobody had declared it. Nobody had announced it. The transition had occurred through 1,000 small procedural changes that added up to complete systemic capture. The regime was installed, not through violence, through paperwork, and it was already too late to file an objection. The orientation packet used words like opportunity and excellence and national service. It described enhanced individual development programs and performance optimization initiatives. The language had been scrubbed clean by lawyers who understood that atrocity required appropriate branding. Kate Dunlap sat in the auditorium with 200 other students who'd received revised enrollment notices over the past 72 hours. The letter had been polite, firm, and utterly non-negotiable report for mandatory curriculum adjustment or forfeit your place in the program. Nobody mentioned what happened to people who refused. The stage held a single podium. Behind it, projected across a screen large enough to make squinting unnecessary, scrolled statistics, throughput rates, success metrics, deployment readiness percentages. The data updated in real time, color-coded for clarity. Green meant acceptable. Yellow indicated areas requiring improvement. Red suggested immediate corrective action. There was a lot of red. Cypher walked to the podium without introduction. She wore a uniform that looked military enough to suggest authority without technically qualifying as armed forces. Her presence commanded attention through stillness rather than performance. "You were told you were special," she began, voice carrying without amplification. "Unique, chosen. The previous administration encouraged that belief because it was profitable. Made you easier to market, easier to control, easier to convince that being extraordinary meant you deserved privileges instead of responsibilities." She paused, letting the words settle into the space between expectation and reality. That era has concluded. You are no longer students preparing for a career. You are assets requiring optimization for deployment. The distinction matters. Sam Reardon felt his hands clench. The medication they'd been giving him had changed formulations 3 days ago. The new compound made everything feel slightly distant, like watching himself from behind glass. He'd asked the medical staff about it. They'd smiled and told him it was part of the enhanced regimen, then escorted him to a room where they drew enough blood to make him lightheaded. Cypher continued. Your training schedule has been restructured around measurable outcomes. Physical conditioning, tactical response threat, neutralization, and psychological resilience. Performance will be quantified daily. Those who meet benchmarks will advance. Those who don't will receive remedial intervention until they do. The screen behind her switched to a flowchart showing the intervention process. The final box labeled Terminal Underperformance didn't specify what happened there. The arrow simply ended. Questions will be addressed during your assigned consultation windows. Dismissed. The auditorium emptied in silence. Nobody wanted to be the first person to speak to draw attention to become the example others learned from. The training facility had been gutted and rebuilt over the weekend. Gone were the practice rooms, designed to look like classroom spaces replaced by modular chambers that could be reconfigured based on test requirements. Each space came equipped with monitoring equipment that tracked biometrics, response times, power output levels. Johnny Quick moved through the facility like a controlled demolition. Appearing in corners, students hadn't checked triggering scenarios without warning. He didn't explain the exercises, didn't offer feedback, just created chaos and recorded how long it took them to adapt. A student with enhanced reflexes managed to dodge the first 3 attacks. The fourth caught him across the jaw hard enough to crack teeth. He went down and medics arrived within 15 seconds, efficient and professional. They tagged him for dental reconstruction and moved him to recovery. Johnny was already 2 floors away, testing someone else's breaking point. Superwoman ran what the schedule called psychological conditioning, but what felt more like targeted humiliation, dressed in therapeutic language. She sat across from small groups, asking questions that seemed supportive, until you realized the answers were being cataloged, weaponized, converted into pressure points. "Tell me about your family," she said to Marie Moreau. Her tone warm, maternal, the kind of voice that made confession feel like relief instead of vulnerability. Marie kept her answers brief, non-committal. She'd learned early that giving people ammunition meant watching them use it. Superwoman smiled like she could read the resistance and appreciated it. "You don't trust authority figures. Understandable given your background. Orphan system, foster care, instability, constant relocation." She leaned forward, elbows on knees, intimacy manufactured with surgical precision. "But that trauma, it's made you strong, resilient, special." The word landed like a hook. Special. The thing every abandoned kid wanted to hear, needed to believe, would trade anything to confirm. "We're going to help you channel that strength. Turn survival instinct into tactical advantage. You've spent your whole life fighting to matter. Here you will. We'll make sure of it." Marie felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing the weight. Then she caught the micro-expression, the flicker in Superwoman's eyes that suggested satisfaction at a mark-taking bait. The warmth evaporated. This wasn't therapy, it was profiling. Power Ring had converted the East Wing into what documentation called enhanced containment infrastructure. The rooms were featureless walls, constructed from material that didn't yield to kinetic force or energy projection. Students were placed inside for timed intervals, told to use their abilities to escape. Nobody escaped. That wasn't the point. The point was data collection, how long until panic set in, what they tried when conventional approaches failed, whether they attacked the walls or themselves when frustration peaked. The recordings went into files that Owlman reviewed each evening, correlating stress responses with deployment potential. High resilience under pressure meant frontline material. Rapid deterioration suggested logistics support or medical experimentation. Everything had a use. Nothing was wasted. Kate had discovered she could access other students' thoughts if she concentrated a violation of privacy that felt necessary when the alternative was stumbling blind through whatever was happening here. What she found in their heads wasn't helpful fear confusion, the desperate hope that compliance would lead to safety. She was accessing Sam's thoughts when she caught something else. A memory of medical procedures. He didn't remember consenting to injections that weren't on his official treatment plan, Octars, discussing dosage adjustments like he was livestock being prepped for market. Before she could dig deeper, his awareness spiked. He felt her presence in his head and shoved back hard enough that she gasped, the psychic recoil leaving her nose bleeding. "Stay out," he said quietly, not looking at her voice carrying warning instead of anger. She wiped the blood away with her sleeve and didn't argue. Whatever they were doing to him, he needed to keep it private. That was his right even here. Especially here. Owlman observed from the control room, overlooking the main training floor, watching multiple screens simultaneously. Each displayed a different student undergoing evaluation. Physiological stress markers scrolled alongside performance data. The correlation was useful. Optimal results occurred when subjects operated at 73% of their breaking point. Push harder and they became erratic. Less pressure and efficiency dropped. Cypher stood beside him, reviewing reports on her tablet. "We've had 3 withdrawals and 1 medical discharge in the first week. Projected attrition rate is within acceptable parameters." "The discharges," Owlman said, not looking away from the screens. "Where are they being processed?" "Standard protocol, exit interviews, non-disclosure agreements, memory modification if they saw anything classified. Define classified: anything that could compromise operational security if disclosed publicly. Owlman made a note. Memory modification had a 37% chance of neural damage when applied to enhanced individuals. The damaged ones would need to be monitored long-term to ensure they didn't become liabilities. More infrastructure, more resources, more points of failure. Adjust the orientation materials, he said. Make voluntary withdrawal more explicitly discouraged. Reduce attrition by making the alternative appear worse than completion. Cypher updated her notes without comment. The adjustment would be implemented by morning. Ultraman appeared in the training floor without warning, his presence causing every student in range to freeze mid-exercise. He walked through their formations, examining technique, posture, commitment. His assessment showed in his expression disappointment that bordered on contempt. He stopped in front of a student whose enhanced strength had been measured at 8 tons during intake testing. "Hit me." The student hesitated. "Sir, I don't—" "Hit me." Ultraman repeated, tone flat. "Full force. Prove you're worth the resources being allocated to your development." The student swung. Put everything into it, the kind of punch that would have shattered concrete. Ultraman didn't move, didn't brace, didn't react. The impact landed and stopped, all that force absorbed like it had struck bedrock. Ultraman looked at his chest where the punch had connected, then back at the student. Pathetic. He backhanded the student hard enough to send him airborne, the trajectory ending against a wall 20 feet away. The impact left a crater in the reinforced material. Medics moved immediately, checking vitals, calling for a stretcher. Ultraman addressed the room. "You are products being manufactured to specification. If you can't meet quality standards, you will be recalled and replaced. The choice is yours: improve or become obsolete." He left. The training resumed after a 30-second pause to remove the injured student. Nobody asked about his condition. The screens showed his vital signs had stabilized, which meant he'd survive. That was sufficient information. Annie, January, had infiltrated the facility 3 hours before dawn, credentials provided by someone inside Vought, who'd been fired during the restructuring and wanted revenge more than they wanted self-preservation. The access badge worked for exactly 17 minutes before the system flagged it as compromised and locked her out of secure areas. 17 minutes was enough to reach the medical wing. She found the files in a cabinet that wasn't properly secured, dozens of folders containing treatment plans that weren't treatments at all. Experimental compounds, genetic modification attempts, procedures designed to push enhanced individuals past their natural limits, regardless of consent. She photographed what she could with a device that had no wireless capability, no connection that could be traced. The flash seemed too loud in the empty corridor. "You shouldn't be here." Annie spun. Marie stood in the doorway looking exhausted and wary, and too young to be carrying the kind of trauma Annie could see in her eyes. "I'm trying to get evidence," Annie said quietly, "to expose what they're doing. They already know what they're doing. So does everyone who matters." Marie's voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd stopped believing in rescue. "Exposure doesn't work when the people who do something about it are the same ones signing the requisition forms. Then what do you want me to do?" Marie was quiet for a long moment. "Then, get out before you end up in one of those files. Some of us are already too deep. Don't make it worse by becoming another casualty that changes nothing." She left before Annie could argue. The guards would arrive in 90 seconds. Annie took 3 more photos and ran. The daily reports compiled overnight and landed on Alman's desk by 6 a.m. Performance metrics, incident logs, resource allocation summaries. He read through them over coffee that someone had learned he preferred black and exactly 170 degrees. 23 students showed measurable improvement across their evaluation matrices. 14 remained static, but within acceptable ranges. 5 had declined to the point of requiring intervention. 2 had been removed from active training pending medical assessment. The mathematics was straightforward. At current rates, they would produce 47 deployment-ready enhanced assets within 6 weeks. Losses were acceptable. Overhead was manageable. The model scaled efficiently. Godolkin had been designed as an educational institution, a place to nurture talent and develop potential. Crime Syndicate had stripped that pretense away and revealed the infrastructure underneath a factory that turned raw material into product with quality control measures built into every stage of production. It was remarkably efficient once you stopped pretending it was anything else. Cypher entered his office without knocking, carrying a tablet showing footage from overnight security sweeps. We had an unauthorized access incident in the medical wing. Low-level credentials flagged and locked out within the quarter hour. Identify the intruder. Clothing suggested enhanced individual, likely someone with prior VOD affiliation based on movement patterns. We're running facial recognition against former personnel databases. Owlman watched the footage. The person moved like they knew how to avoid cameras, which meant training. Increase security protocols for sensitive areas. If they extracted data, it won't be usable without corroboration we can deny. Ensure anyone who might serve as a witness understands the consequences of disclosure. Already implemented. He returned to his reports. The infiltration was a nuisance, not a threat. Let them have their stolen photographs, their documentation of procedures. Who would they show it to? Who had authority to intervene? Who wasn't already complicit in the system that had built this place? The resistance wanted evidence. Crime Syndicate had made evidence irrelevant. On the training floor, students continued their exercises under observation. Power Ring monitored stress responses from his control station. Johnny Quick engineered failures to measure recovery times. Superwoman conducted sessions that left participants feeling simultaneously validated and violated. Ultraman appeared at irregular intervals, his presence alone sufficient to modify behavior. Fear was a more effective teacher than any curriculum. The screens in Owlman's office showed real-time data, heart rates, cortisol levels, power output measurements. The students had become numbers, and the numbers were trending toward optimization. This was the future. Not heroes, assets. And the production line never stopped. The safe house smelled like mold, and decades-old cigarette smoke embedded in drywall that couldn't be cleaned. Butcher preferred it that way. Modern buildings had too many access points for surveillance smart meters, HVAC sensors, fiber optic lines that carried more than internet traffic. This place was analog, forgotten, the kind of location that existed in bureaucratic dead zones where permits had been filed wrong and nobody cared enough to correct them. Spread documents across a table that wobbled on uneven legs. Leaked personnel files from Godolkin medical reports with redactions that told more than the visible text requisition orders for equipment that had no legitimate educational purpose. 3 weeks of careful extraction, dead drops. In locations, they changed daily information compiled from sources who'd disappeared before they could be thanked. We leaked this to the right journalist, he said, tapping a particularly damning medical log. It forces an investigation. Congressional oversight, public outcry, the whole mechanism that's supposed to prevent this kind of thing. Annie sat on a crate that had once held ammunition arms wrapped around her knees. She'd been quiet since returning from Godolkin, carrying the kind of silence that came from watching hope get industrialized into despair. They already know. Everyone who could stop it signed the authorization. Then we go around them, direct to public, unfiltered. Huey had been monitoring independent media tracking, which outlets hadn't been absorbed into the new coordination structure. The list was smaller than it should have been. There are still people who'll run this if what? Butcher's voice cut through the planning like a blade finding cartilage. If we give them evidence they'll pretend to care about. Evidence that'll be contextualized and fact-checked by the same bloody machine that's running the camps. He pulled out a different folder. This one containing surveillance photos of Power Ring entering federal buildings under an alias nobody had bothered to question. We're not leaking documents. We're hitting infrastructure. Take out their control nodes, force them to operate in the open instead of through proxies. Looked at the photos, then at Butcher. Hitting a federal official is an act of terrorism under current law. They've already labeled resistance as domestic threat activity. This confirms every narrative they've been selling. Good. Let them see us as threats. Better than being invisible while they optimize the whole damn country into a prison. The argument would have continued had in fact continued for the past 72 hours in variations that changed tactics, but not fundamental disagreement. Annie stood abruptly, the movement cutting through the circular logic. I'm going back for Marie. Both plans stopped. Butcher and stared at her. She's one student, Butcher said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. You pull her out, they'll replace her with 3 others and tighten security. Risk-reward doesn't balance. She's a person, not a calculation. She's a person who'll be a corpse if you blow our position trying to rescue someone who's already told you to leave her behind. Annie's hands clenched. Light flickered at her fingertips, involuntary, the kind of power leak that happened when emotion overrode control. So we do nothing, just document atrocities and hope someone eventually cares enough to make it stop. We do what works, said quietly. Which means we think 3 moves ahead instead of 1. Owlman's been running scenarios since before we knew his name. Every action we take, he's probably gamed it out and prepared counters. We need to be smarter than our anger. Butcher lit a cigarette despite the enclosed space. Despite MM's immediate glare, despite every rational argument about avoiding detectable traces. Or we accept we're not going to outsmart him. And we hit him anyway, because sitting here playing chess with a bastard who's already won is worse than dying trying. The leaked documents went live at 3 a.m. through 6 different independent news sites, simultaneously uploaded from terminals in internet cafes that would be abandoned before dawn. The files were comprehensive, properly sourced, impossible to dismiss as fabrication. Medical procedures without consent. Training regimens that qualified as torture under Geneva Conventions. Casualty rates that suggested acceptable losses had been calculated in advance. By 8 a.m., every major network was running the story. By 9 a.m., fact-checkers had raised questions about document authenticity. By 10 a.m., Godolkin University had released a statement expressing concern about malicious disinformation campaigns designed to undermine enhanced individual development programs. By noon, Superwoman was on 3 different talk shows explaining how enemies of progress often weaponized legitimate safety concerns to halt necessary reforms. Of course, training is rigorous, she said, her tone carrying practiced sympathy. These young people are being prepared for roles that require extraordinary resilience. But to suggest we're harming them. She shook her head, the gesture perfectly calibrated. That's exactly the kind of narrative that puts our future protectors at risk by making the public afraid of the very measures keeping them safe. The host nodded along, following questions that had been provided in advance by production staff who'd received those questions from a consulting firm that didn't exist 3 weeks ago. What about the medical reports showing injuries inconsistent with standard training protocols? Context matters. Superwoman leaned forward, engaging the camera directly. Enhanced individuals heal differently. What looks like severe trauma to civilian doctors is often minor injury that resolves within hours. But when you strip that context away, when you present medical data without the expertise to interpret it, you create fear where there should be trust. The documents the boys had leaked were being contextualized, reframed, and ultimately dismissed faster than they'd been released. The mechanism didn't need to suppress the information. It just needed to make the information meaningless. Power Ring sat in his office, reviewing the leak's propagation pattern tracking. Which terminals had uploaded the files, cross-referencing timestamps with surveillance footage from nearby businesses. The pattern was sloppy. Multiple upload sites suggested they were trying to obscure the source, but the timing intervals indicated coordination from a central location. He pulled up a map, overlaid the locations, and ran probability algorithms. The most likely command center fell within a 3-block radius in a neighborhood that had declined enough to have blind spots in municipal surveillance coverage. He drafted a memo to local law enforcement suggesting increased patrols in that sector. Routine presence, nothing aggressive. Just enough pressure to make the boys relocate, which would generate new patterns to analyze. Alman read the memo over coffee, approved it with a digital signature, and returned to other matters. The boys were behaving exactly as projected. Leak information. Wait for public outcry. Assume democratic mechanisms would function as designed. They still believed in systems that Crime Syndicate had already absorbed. The rescue operation began at 2 a.m. Annie had mapped Godolkin's patrol rotations, identified a shift change vulnerability that lasted exactly 4 minutes. Huey would create a power disruption timed to the window. Annie would extract Marie, and whoever else could move quickly. M had a vehicle positioned 3 blocks away, with fuel for 600 miles and false plates that would pass casual inspection. The power failed on schedule. Annie moved through corridors she'd memorized, reaching the residential wing, where students were housed in rooms that locked from the outside. She found Marie's door, popped the electronic lock with an electromagnetic pulse that fried the mechanism. Marie was awake, sitting on her bed like she'd been expecting this. "Come on," Annie whispered. 30 seconds before backup power kicks in. "They let you in," Marie said, not moving. "The vulnerability you found isn't real. They left it there to see who'd use it." Annie's stomach dropped. "How do you—" "Because I've been watching them study us. They don't make mistakes. They create scenarios and measure responses." Marie stood, moving to the window. "You being here means they wanted you here, which means leaving with you is exactly what they've prepared for." The backup power engaged. Lights flooded the corridor. Alarms began screaming, not the kind that suggested surprise, but the kind that announced a triggered trap. Annie grabbed Marie's arm. "Then we go anyway. Standing here debating it just makes it worse." They ran, made it to the exterior door before it sealed with pneumatic locks that engaged from a central control panel. Annie tried to short it out. The circuits were hardened against electromagnetic interference. She started to blast through the door itself when Marie pulled her back. "Stop. They'll say we were violent, that we attacked staff, that we're exactly the threat they've been warning about." "I don't care what they—" "You should." Marie's grip tightened. "Because whoever you're trying to save by exposing them, those people will watch the footage of you blowing through security barriers and believe every word about domestic terrorists undermining public safety." The security team arrived. Enhanced officers, deputized, equipped with restraints designed for people with abilities. They moved with professional efficiency, no brutality, everything by procedure. The kind of arrest that would look entirely justified on body camera footage. Annie could have fought, could have hurt them badly enough to escape. The calculation lasted half a second. Win this fight, lose every fight after, when the footage played on loop showing enhanced individuals attacking law enforcement. She put her hands up. Let them cuff her with restraints that suppressed her abilities through electrical interference. Watch them do the same to Marie. Gentle, professional, completely legal. The camera footage would be perfect. No abuse, no excessive force, just necessary intervention against individuals attempting to remove minors from protective custody without authorization. Butcher watched the arrest footage from the safe house, his expression stone. M.M. sat beside him, jaw clenched so tight it had to hurt. Huey had his head in his hands, laptop still open to the power grid interface he'd used to create the distraction. "They knew," Huey said, voice hollow. "Every step. They let us get close enough to try and fail." "Course they bloody knew." Butcher drained the whiskey he'd been nursing since midnight. "They've been 10 moves ahead since they got here. Questions not how they beat us. Questions what we're willing to do when playing by any rules means losing. MM looked at him, seeing where this was heading. Don't what? Don't acknowledge we're out of clever options. Don't accept that leaking, rescuing, and resisting through proper channels just feeds their system. Butcher stood pacing the small room. We've got one thing they can't absorb, can't reframe, can't optimize into their machinery: the virus. The weapon Butcher had been carrying like a talisman, waiting for the moment when burning it all down became the only move left. You release that you don't just kill Crime Syndicate, MM said carefully. You kill every enhanced individual in range, including the ones we're trying to save. Yeah, I know. Butcher's voice carried the weight of someone who'd already made peace with damnation. But it kills them too. And sometimes that's the only win you get, making sure the bastards don't walk away clean. The news cycle had moved on from the leaked documents by evening. New stories, new crises, new content to fill the endless feed. The information the boys had risked everything to expose had been consumed, processed, and excreted as yesterday's concern. Alman reviewed the day's reports with satisfaction. The boys had played exactly as expected: gather evidence, leak it publicly, attempt rescue when leak failed, escalate to violence when rescue failed. Each action predictable, each response prepared, each outcome controlled. They were good at resistance, clever, resourceful, motivated by genuine principle. But they operated within paradigms that Crime Syndicate had already mapped and surpassed. They still believed in exposure as accountability and rescue, as victory in systems that would eventually correct themselves if provided sufficient evidence. Those beliefs made them manageable, predictable, useful as proof that dissent was allowed, while simultaneously demonstrating that dissent didn't matter. He filed the reports and moved to the next item requiring attention. The boys would continue resisting because that's what people like them did. And Crime Syndicate would continue absorbing that resistance because that's what properly designed systems did. The equilibrium was sustainable, unless they abandoned principle entirely and embraced pure destruction. But people like the boys rarely made that choice until it was too late to matter. Butcher sat alone. Huey had collapsed into exhausted sleep. He held the vial containing the virus, the thing that had been engineered to kill enhanced individuals indiscriminately. Compound V derivatives, the doctor had said. Targets the genetic markers, spreads through contact. Release it in the right location, you could exterminate enhanced populations across entire cities, maybe continents given time and proper vectors. The question wasn't whether he'd use it. The question was when the math finally balanced, when saving people meant killing them, when resistance meant surrender, when the only way to prevent Crime Syndicate's victory was ensuring nobody won at all. He didn't have the answer yet. But he could feel it approaching, the moment when every other option had been exhausted, and only the unthinkable remained. Outside, the city continued operating under new management that looked identical to old management, except more efficient, more honest about its brutality, more willing to call control what it actually was instead of pretending it was freedom. The resistance had tried dirty tactics and discovered Crime Syndicate was dirtier. Had tried to save people and made them targets. Had tried to expose evil and watched it get rebranded as necessity. All that remained was the choice between acceptance and annihilation. And Butcher had never been very good at accepting things. The vial was smaller than it should have been for something that could extinguish populations. Clear glass liquid inside, appearing no different from saline solution, the kind of medical mundanity that made apocalypse look like a labeling error. Butcher placed it on the table between himself and the gesture careful, deliberate, final. Been carrying this for 6 months, he said. Waiting for the moment when every other option had been used up and proven useless. Reckon we're there. Stared at the vial without touching it. That's weaponized genocide. That's the only thing Crime Syndicate can't absorb into their machinery. Can't rebrand extermination as enhanced security measures. Butcher's voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd already made peace with a damnation. They've beaten us at everything else because they're better at using the system than we are. This doesn't use the system. It burns it down. Annie stood near the wall. Arms crossed, expression caught between horror and the exhausted recognition that horror had stopped being a useful reaction weeks ago. How does it work? Targets compound V derivatives at the genetic level. Spreads through contact airborne after initial infection. Vectors establish. Release it in the right location, you could wipe enhanced individuals across entire cities inside 72 hours. Including the people we're trying to save, MM said quietly. Including everyone who's been turned into weapons, whether they wanted it or not, yeah. Butcher met his gaze without flinching. But also including Crime Syndicate. Every single one of them. Which means they stop permanently. No more takeovers, no more optimization, no more factory farms turning kids into assets. Huey had been silent since Butcher revealed the vial, staring at it like it might detonate from attention alone. There has to be another way. There was. We tried 12 of them over the past 3 weeks. Every single one failed because Owlman already knew what we'd do before we did it. Butcher picked up the vial, held it to the light. This is what happens when you run out of clever. You're left with blunt. The argument would have continued, had been continuing in variations since the vial entered the conversation. Except MM's phone vibrated with an incoming message from a number that changed daily. He read it, expression shifting from tension to something colder. Cypher's moving Project Odessa into active phase. Full integration with existing compound V infrastructure. He looked up. They're not just making more enhanced individuals. They're modifying the base formula, creating variants. Variants that might not be targeted by a virus designed for the original compound. Annie said, following the logic to its inevitable conclusion. They're already adapting. Butcher set the vial down harder than necessary. Then we use it before they finish adapting. Strike while it still works, and kill everyone who hasn't been modified yet along with them, MM countered. Marie, Sam, Kate, every student in Godalkin, every deputized officer, every enhanced civilian who never asked to be part of this. You're talking about millions of casualties. I'm talking about the only move that stops Crime Syndicate from turning this entire country into an assembly line for producing controlled populations. Butcher's jaw tightened. You want to wait until they've optimized their way into a system that doesn't need violence anymore, because everyone's too grateful for stability to remember what freedom tasted like. The silence stretched until Annie broke it. We're not releasing it, not yet, but we let them know it exists. Both men turned to look at her. A threat's only useful if the people you're threatening know about it, she continued, voice gaining certainty. Right now they think they've won. Let them understand there's a fail-safe they can't neutralize. Maybe that changes the calculation. Maybe fear of annihilation does what resistance couldn't. MM considered this. You're gambling that Crime Syndicate values self-preservation over conquest. I'm gambling that even conquerors don't want to inherit a graveyard. Owlman received the message through channels designed to be untraceable, but which he'd compromised 3 days after establishing operational control. The text was brief. We have a biological countermeasure. Compound 5, specific. Airborne. You stop, or everyone stops. He read it twice, cross-referenced the phrasing against linguistic analysis. Masits of previous communications, attributed to the boys, confirmed authorship probability at 91%. Then he pulled up files on historical biological weapons programs, focusing on viral vectors targeting genetic markers. The science was sound. Difficult but achievable with proper resources, the threat was credible. He drafted 3 memos simultaneously. One to Power Ring requesting immediate containment protocol, Development 1 to medical research teams, requesting accelerated work on Compound V variants 1 to Cipher, regarding Project Odessa timeline adjustments. Then he scheduled a meeting with the rest of Crime Syndicate for 1800 hours. No location specified, they'd know to converge on the operations center that had become their de facto headquarters. The conversation would be interesting. Ultraman arrived first, moving through the space with the restless energy of someone who'd been denied the outlet he preferred. He read the message Owlman had forwarded, expression shifting from boredom to something approaching interest. "They're bluffing. Probability suggests otherwise." Owlman replied without looking up from his analysis. "The boys have demonstrated consistent willingness to sacrifice for strategic advantage. A biological weapon fits their operational profile. Then we find whoever's carrying it and remove them from the equation, which achieves nothing if they've distributed samples or established dead man switches." Owlman finally met Ultraman's gaze. "This isn't a problem you can solve by hitting harder." Ultraman's eyes narrowed. "Everything's a problem I can solve by hitting harder. The difference is whether I choose to use precision or overwhelming force." Before Owlman could respond, Power Ring materialized in the corner, his presence announced by the sickly green glow that preceded full manifestation. The ring on his finger pulsed with independent rhythm, almost like a heartbeat that didn't match its host's. "The biological threat represents an interesting variable," he said, voice carrying its usual affectless drone. "Suggests containment and isolation protocols. Enhanced individuals would need to be segregated from potential infection vectors. Quarantine infrastructure already exists. Simply requires expansion." Something in his tone suggested the expansion wasn't his idea. The ring pulsed again brighter. Superwoman entered last, having taken time to ensure her arrival was perfectly timed. To neither early nor late, the kind of calculated entrance that communicated authority without announcing it. She'd read the message en route. "This changes nothing," she said, settling into a chair with practiced elegance. "Fear of death is useful for control. They've just given us another pressure point. We threaten to release virus if they resist. They threaten to release it if we advance. Mutual assured destruction becomes a negotiating position instead of an endpoint. That assumes they're rational actors," Owlman noted. "Evidence suggests desperation has compromised their decision-making capacity. Desperate people make unpredictable choices. Desperate people make exploitable choices." Superwoman's smile carried edges. "Find out who they care about, who they're trying to protect. Make those people conditional. Suddenly the virus becomes less attractive when using it means sacrificing the very people they're fighting for." Johnny Quick had been leaning against the wall, vibrating with barely contained energy, absorbing the conversation through fragments. Because sitting still long enough to process complete sentences was increasingly difficult. The new compound they'd given him to enhance his speed came with side effects nobody had mentioned. Time dilation, perceptual distortion, the sense that everyone else was moving through molasses while he existed in accelerated reality. "We could just kill everyone who knows about it," he said, the words arriving faster than comfortable conversational pacing. "Blitz every safe house, every contact, every person who's ever looked at the boys funny. Saturation elimination. Can't use the weapon if you're dead. That escalates into exactly the scenario we're trying to avoid," Owlman said. "Mass casualties trigger unpredictable responses. Better to contain the threat through systematic pressure than create martyrs who inspire expansion of resistance networks." Ultraman stood abruptly, the movement sharp enough to make furniture creak. "You're all talking like this is a negotiation. It's not. It's a countdown to someone making a choice we can't undo. I say we eliminate the threat, now consequences be damned before they get desperate enough to use it. And if elimination fails..." Owlman's tone remained level. "If they've prepared for exactly that response and use your attack as justification for release, Then at least we tried something instead of sitting here running probability scenarios while they sharpen the knife they're going to use on us. The tension between them had been building since the takeover began, Ultraman's preference for immediate domination versus Owlman's systematic control. The virus had crystallized it into open conflict. Power Ring's voice cut through before the argument could escalate. The ring suggests isolation protocols. Separate enhanced populations into controllable sectors, limit contact vectors, make viral spread impossible through geographic containment. The phrasing was wrong. Power Ring never referred to the ring as making suggestions. It was a tool, nothing more. But the glow had intensified, and his eyes showed the glassy focus of someone listening to voices others couldn't hear. Owlman noticed, made a note. The ring had been exhibiting increasing autonomy over the past week, small deviations from expected behavior that suggested the entity inside wasn't content with passive hosting anymore. Another variable, another potential fracture point. Superwoman was watching Ultraman and Owlman's dynamic with calculated interest, already running scenarios about what happened when their alliance shattered. Crime Syndicate had always been a coalition of mutual benefit, rather than genuine loyalty. Stress revealed fault lines. The virus was stress incarnate. We proceed as planned. Owlman said, voice cutting through the various tensions with administrative finality. Accelerate Odessa to create compound 5 variants the current virus can't target. Develop containment protocols for enhanced populations. Monitor the boys for any indication they're preparing to deploy. And most importantly, he looked at each of them in turn, we maintain unified position publicly. The moment they sense division, they'll exploit it. Ultraman's expression suggested he was done taking orders, but hadn't yet decided to act on that impulse. Fine, but when this blows up because you're too busy playing systems architect instead of solving problems, don't expect me to clean up the mess you've made. He left without waiting for dismissal, the door slamming with enough force to crack the frame. Johnny Quick followed moving as Blur's departure creating minor wind disturbance that scattered papers across the desk. Power Ring dematerialized without comment, the green glow fading last, almost reluctant to release its grip on visible reality. Superwoman remained seated, studying Owlman with the attention of someone cataloging weaknesses for future exploitation. He's not wrong, you know. The longer we wait, the more likely they find an opening we haven't covered. Agreed. Which is why we're not waiting. We're preparing. Owlman pulled up schematics showing modified detention facilities across 3 states. If they use the virus, these locations become quarantine centers. If they don't, they become permanent housing for anyone who might be tempted to join resistance movements. Either outcome serves our interests. You're building concentration camps. I'm building infrastructure for population management during crisis scenarios. The terminology is irrelevant compared to the functionality. Superwoman stood moving toward the exit with unhurried grace. Just remember, when people build tools for control, they usually end up controlled by them. She left, leaving Owlman alone with maps and contingency plans and the growing certainty that the virus had changed the game in ways that made victory and defeat increasingly difficult to distinguish. The boys sat in their safe house staring at the vial that had become the center of every conversation, every decision, every moment of doubt about whether resistance meant anything, when the only weapon left was annihilation. They know now, Annie said quietly, which means they're preparing counters. Good. Butcher's voice carried grim satisfaction. Let them prepare. Let them feel what it's like to have someone standing over them, with power they can't control, can't absorb, can't optimize into their machinery. Maybe fear teaches them what all their clever system building couldn't. Was running calculations on his laptop, modeling viral spread patterns against population density maps. The numbers were horrifying. Even limited deployment would result in casualties measured in tens of thousands. Full release could approach millions before the infection burned itself out. We can't actually use this, he said, voice hollow. The math doesn't work. Even if we target crime syndicate, collateral casualties would be. I know what they'd be, Butcher interrupted. Been running those numbers every night for 6 months. Doesn't change the fact that it's the only thing that makes them vulnerable. Being vulnerable isn't the same as being defeated. They'll adapt, create variants, maybe develop immunity. All we've done is start an arms race we can't win because they have more resources. Then we use it before they finish adapting. The same argument cycling back to the same terrible conclusion. The virus existed. Knowing about it changed nothing except making the weight of potential decision heavier with each passing hour. Huey had been silent, staring at projections showing infection, spread models. What if we're wrong? What if releasing it doesn't stop them, just makes them worse? Gives them justification for every brutal measure they want to implement. Nobody had an answer. The virus was supposed to be the solution, the weapon that finally balanced scales too tilted toward systemic power. But weapons didn't care about intentions. They just killed whoever happened to be in range when someone pulled the trigger. Outside, the city continued operating under its new administration. People went to work, bought coffee, watched entertainment that had been subtly adjusted to normalize the current state of affairs. The transition from occupation to ordinary had completed so smoothly that most couldn't identify when it happened. Crime Syndicate had won everything except certainty that their victory was permanent. The boys had lost everything except the capacity for mutual annihilation. And between those two positions sat a vial of clear liquid that represented the only answer nobody wanted to give. The question wasn't whether someone would use it. The question was, who would decide that using it was preferable to living in the world it was designed to destroy? The first crack appeared as a disagreement over response time. Ultraman wanted immediate action, locate, Butcher, neutralize the biological threat, resume operations. Owlman had issued orders to maintain current posture, while intelligence networks mapped distribution points and fail-safe mechanisms. The contradiction wasn't subtle. It was two competing command structures occupying the same operational space. Ultraman ignored the orders. He'd been ignoring Owlman's procedural mandates for 3 days, each instance small enough to dismiss as tactical autonomy until they accumulated into pattern. This morning, he'd deployed enhanced units to raid suspected resistance locations, without clearance, without coordination, without consideration for what burning through assets might cost in the broader campaign. The raids yielded nothing except corpses and confirmation that the boys had already relocated. Owlman watched surveillance footage of the operations from his office, noting the inefficiency, the wasted resources, the strategic bankruptcy of using a sledgehammer when the situation required scalpel precision. He drafted a memo establishing unified command authority for all operational decisions pending threat resolution. Ultraman received the memo, read it once, and sent back a single-line response. "You're not my handler." The rupture was official. Power Ring had been experiencing what the Ring's previous hosts might have called disagreements. Except the Ring didn't disagree. It simply began making decisions that superseded conscious intent. Small adjustments at first containment fields, extending beyond designated parameters, isolation protocols, activating without authorization requests, surveillance expanding into areas that hadn't been flagged for monitoring. The Ring wanted order. Complete, total, inflexible order. Every variable controlled, every outcome predetermined, every element of chaos eliminated through force or confinement. Its hosts' willingness to cooperate was becoming optional. When Ultraman's unauthorized raids created instability in 3 city sectors, Power Ring responded by establishing quarantine perimeters around the affected zones. No consultation, no warning. Green barriers materialized across 12 square blocks, trapping civilians and combatants alike in geometric prisons that didn't acknowledge the difference between threat and bystander. The Ring pulsed with satisfaction at a problem neatly contained. Its host tried to dismiss the barriers. The Ring declined. Override attempts failed. For the first time since bonding the entity wearing Power Ring's body, understood it was no longer the primary decision-maker in the relationship. Superwoman had been monitoring the fractures with the attention of someone watching cracks spread across load-bearing walls, calculating which failures would be most spectacular when they finally gave way. Crime Syndicate's unity had always been transactional mutual benefit, masquerading as loyalty. Stress revealed the transaction's terms. She made calls to media contacts she'd cultivated, the ones who understood that access meant complicity, but couldn't resist the ratings that came with proximity to power. By noon, camera crews were positioned at strategic locations, filming barriers that shouldn't exist. Raids that hadn't been publicly authorized, a city beginning to recognize that the people claiming to stabilize it were fracturing under their own contradictions. "We're witnessing unprecedented coordination challenges," she told a reporter whose credentials she'd personally approved, standing in front of a containment barrier that glowed with sickly luminescence. The transition to enhanced security measures requires adjustments. Some elements of our coalition have differing philosophies about implementation timelines. Translation: they're eating each other, and I'm making sure everyone watches. The footage would loop for 18 hours across every major network. Public opinion didn't need to turn against Crime Syndicate. It just needed to stop being certain they were in control. Johnny Quick had stopped taking orders 3 days ago, around the time his neurochemistry began rewriting itself in response to compounds designed to push enhanced metabolism past sustainable limits. Time had become elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that made communication feel like shouting across canyons, while everyone else moved through frozen moments. He didn't attend the emergency coordination meeting Owlman had called. Didn't respond to summons. Instead, he ran circuits through the city at speeds that left sonic disruption in his wake, shattering windows, triggering car alarms, creating localized chaos that served no strategic purpose except proving he could. When Owlman's security detail tried to intercept him for debriefing, he was already 4 miles away, laughing at velocities that made sound arrive late and wrong. Control required subjects willing to be controlled. Johnny Quick had passed that threshold sometime between his last injection and the moment he realized he preferred the chaos. Owlman sat in the operations center reviewing real-time status reports that painted a picture of systematic collapse. Power Ring had locked down 17% of the city without authorization. Ultraman was conducting independent operations that undermined intelligence networks. Superwoman was providing commentary to media outlets that reframed their mission from security to spectacle. Johnny Quick had become a variable that couldn't be predicted or contained. The coalition was disintegrating exactly as game theory suggested. It would not through external pressure, but internal contradiction. They'd conquered through alignment of interests. Maintaining conquest required continued alignment. The virus had disrupted that calculation by introducing a threat none of them processed identically. He pulled up schematics showing modified detention facilities, the ones designed to become quarantine centers or permanent housing, depending on how events unfolded. If Crime Syndicate couldn't maintain unified control, the infrastructure could still serve. Systems outlasted the people who built them. That was their advantage. His tablet chimed with an incoming transmission from Ultraman coordinates and a timestamp. No context, no explanation. The location was Godolkin University. The time was 90 minutes from now. It wasn't a request for meeting. It was a declaration of intent. Owlman archived the message and began preparing contingencies. The boys had relocated to a warehouse that had been abandoned long enough that squatters had moved in and left, declaring even free housing not worth the structural instability. Water damage had made the second floor unsafe. The roof leaked in places that suggested targeted precision rather than random decay. It was perfect. monitored emergency band radio chatter, tracking the escalating chaos that Crime Syndicate was trying to contain while simultaneously causing. Unauthorized raids, unexplained barriers, media coverage that suggested coordination problems. The facade was cracking. "They're falling apart," Huey said, not quite allowing himself the hope. "Maybe we don't need the—" He gestured at the vial Butcher had placed on a makeshift table, the thing that had become the gravitational center of every conversation. "They're falling apart into our laps," MM corrected. Power rings barriers aren't distinguishing between enhanced individuals and civilians. Ultraman's raids are hitting neighborhoods with no strategic value. Whatever's happening to them, it's happening to everyone in range. Annie was monitoring news coverage on a device they'd modified to receive but not transmit. Superwoman's interview was playing on loop across multiple channels, her carefully crafted framing, turning internal conflict into theater. The comment sections were beginning to shift not toward outrage, but toward entertainment. Crime Syndicate destroying itself was content, and content was consumable regardless of casualties. "We could use this," she said quietly. "While they're distracted, get Marie out. Extract other students, actually save someone instead of just documenting atrocities. Or we could stay out of their crossfire and let them bleed each other dry." Butcher's voice carried the weight of someone who'd already calculated acceptable losses. "Every minute they spend fighting each other is a minute they're not hunting us. And every minute we wait is time they could reconcile. Or worse, one of them could win." MM looked at the vial, then at Butcher. "You really think staying invisible while they tear the city apart is survivable? I think trying to be heroes while they're tearing the city apart gets us killed for nothing." Butcher met his gaze without flinching. "We move when they're weakest. Right now, they're just wounded. Wounded animals are the most dangerous kind." The argument would have continued, except Annie's monitoring device began displaying emergency alerts. Multiple sectors under lockdown. Civilian casualties reported. Enhanced individual conflicts in progress. The city was becoming a battlefield where the combatants didn't care about collateral damage because they'd stopped distinguishing between strategic targets and obstacles. "We have to do something," Annie said, voice strained. "We are doing something," Butcher replied. "We're staying alive. That's the only thing that matters when everything else is burning." Ultraman arrived at Godolkin 90 minutes after sending the coordinates, moving through security checkpoints that had been designed to stop unauthorized entry, but which meant nothing to someone who could simply walk through walls after punching them into rubble. The facility had been fortified since Crime Syndicate took control. Reinforced barriers, automated defenses, fail-safes designed by people who understood how to contain enhanced threats. None of it slowed him down. He found Owlman in the administration wing, standing before monitors showing real-time surveillance of training chambers, medical wings, containment cells. The infrastructure of industrialized enhancement operating at optimal efficiency, even as the organization that built it fractured. "You called this meeting," Owlman said without turning from the screens. "State your concern." "My concern is you've built a machine we can't turn off and don't fully control." Ultraman gestured at the monitors, showing students undergoing procedures that existed in documentation gaps where oversight had been written out. "This entire operation assumes we maintain unity long enough to manage it. We don't. You know we don't. So what happens when the system keeps running without us? The system continues serving its function. That's what makes it superior to personality-driven leadership. Unless its function becomes autonomous. Unless Power Ring's containment protocols start making decisions that contradict our objectives. Unless the infrastructure you've built decides it doesn't need builders anymore." Owlman finally turned his expression, suggesting he'd been waiting for this conversation. "You want me to dismantle the operational framework because you're uncomfortable with efficiency that doesn't require your direct involvement. I want you to acknowledge that we've created something that might not stop when we tell it to." "Good. That's the point. Systems that require constant personal intervention are vulnerable to disruption. Self-sustaining systems maintain function regardless of individual actors." Owlman's tone carried the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a remedial student. You think in terms of conquest, take territory, hold it through force. I think in terms of inevitability, build systems that make resistance irrelevant. And when your systems start making choices you didn't program into them, then they've evolved beyond their initial parameters, still serving the broader objective of order just through methods we didn't anticipate. He returned his attention to the monitors. That's acceptable. Ultraman moved. Not fast, not dramatic, just close enough that the air pressure changed, that breathing space became threatened territory. You're comfortable with machines making decisions about who lives and who gets optimized into assets. I'm comfortable with efficiency. Whether that comes from human decisions or systematic process is irrelevant compared to outcomes. The punch came without telegraphing. Ultraman's fist connected with Owlman's jaw hard enough to send him through the reinforced wall into the adjacent corridor. Structural supports cracked. Alarms began screaming. Emergency protocols activated across the facility, lockdown procedures, containment measures, automated responses designed for exactly this scenario. Owlman stood from the rubble, blood trailing from his mouth, expression unchanged. Predictable. He pressed a sequence into a device built into his suit. The facility's defense systems activated with prejudice, electromagnetic nets, concussive charges, restraint mechanisms designed to handle superhuman threats. Ultraman shrugged through them like cobwebs, each barrier failing against force that didn't acknowledge resistance. But they slowed him. Bought seconds. Enough time for Owlman to access the thing he'd kept as insurance against exactly this rupture, a weaponized version of the power ring's containment fields, modified to target Kryptonian physiology. Powered by infrastructure Ultraman had helped build without understanding its secondary purpose. Green light erupted from concealed emitters, forming a cage that even Ultraman couldn't immediately shatter. Not permanent, nothing held him permanently, but adequate for tactical repositioning. You wanted immediate solutions, Owlman said, already moving toward exits that would seal behind him. This is immediate. Containment while I implement more permanent arrangements. That's odd. He left Ultraman hammering against barriers that wouldn't break quickly enough to matter each impact, causing structural damage that would require evacuation, but which served the broader purpose of removing the variable that had become liability. Power ring manifested in the medical wing, drawn by alarms that indicated unauthorized combat. The ring assessed the situation with mechanical precision. 2 authority figures in conflict, infrastructure damage, creating instability. Optimal solution requiring neutralization of both parties to restore order. It began constructing containment fields without consulting its host's preferences. Green geometric patterns spread through corridors, isolating combatants, separating witnesses, establishing zones of control that didn't acknowledge human priority. The facility's students found themselves locked in chambers that had been training rooms seconds ago. Staff were separated into categories: essential, non-essential, potential threat. The ring was optimizing, creating perfect order through perfect isolation. Its host tried to stop the expansion. The ring interpreted resistance as malfunction and began suppressing autonomy at the neurological level. Control was necessary. Dissent was inefficient. Power ring stopped trying to countermand the instructions. Not because he agreed, but because the entity wearing his body was no longer the one making decisions. Superwoman stood outside Godolkin's perimeter, with camera crews capturing every moment of the facility's lockdown, emergency vehicles being denied entry, the visible signs of internal breakdown manifesting as external crisis. She'd positioned herself perfectly close enough to seem involved, distant enough to avoid culpability. What we're witnessing is the natural tension between security and liberty, she told the cameras, her delivery carrying practiced concern. Some believe protection requires absolute control. Others prefer flexibility. The disagreement is philosophical, not operational. Behind her, Godolkin's exterior walls showed cracks from internal combat. Emergency lights strobed. Civilians who'd been trapped inside during visiting hours began appearing in windows, phones, pressed to glass, recording their own captivity for audiences who would watch and share and forget once the next crisis replaced this one. The broadcast wasn't meant to turn opinion against crime syndicate. It was meant to demonstrate that even conquerors could be entertainment, that chaos was content, that the spectacle mattered more than the outcome. Ratings were exceptional. Johnny Quick arrived as afterimage, stopping long enough to register the situation before moving again, trajectory calculated to maximize disruption rather than resolve it. He ran through police barriers, scattered emergency responders, created paths for trapped civilians to escape, while simultaneously making coordinated rescue impossible. Not saving them, just redistributing the chaos. When Alman's security forces tried to establish perimeter control, Johnny dismantled their equipment at speeds that made causality seem negotiable. By the time they realized he'd been there, he was gone, leaving only the wreckage of their attempts at order. The boys watched the coverage from their warehouse, seeing crime syndicate fracture in real time, recognizing the opportunity and the trap it represented. Move now, and they'd be caught in crossfire between forces that viewed collateral damage as acceptable parameter. Wait, and the consolidation would come. Whoever survived the internal purge would emerge stronger for having shed the weakness. "We could leak the virus now," Huey said quietly. "Not use it. Just let them know we have multiple samples." "That killing butcher doesn't eliminate the threat." "They already know that," MM replied. "Owlman would have planned for distribution. This isn't about the weapon. It's about who controls what happens next." Annie made the decision before the others could argue against it. She stood heading for the exit, purpose clear in her posture. "Where are you going?" Butcher's voice carried warning rather than curiosity. "Godolkin. While they're occupied tearing each other apart, I'm getting Marie out." "That's suicide." "Probably. But sitting here while people die because we're too tactical to be decent is worse." She didn't wait for permission, didn't argue about odds. Just left knowing the window was small and closing. Butcher watched her go, jaw tight. She's going to get killed, trying to save one person who probably doesn't want saving. "Yeah," Mem agreed. "But if we don't try, what's the difference between us and them?" The question hung in the air like smoke from something burning that nobody could extinguish. Outside, the city continued fragmenting. Power Ring's barriers expanded without coordination. Ultraman's containment wouldn't hold indefinitely. Superwoman's broadcast was reaching millions. Johnny Quick was converting infrastructure into kinetic art. And somewhere in the chaos, the virus remained unused, undestroyed, waiting for someone to decide that mutual annihilation was preferable to occupation by either side. The Civil War wasn't ending. It was metastasizing, spreading through systems that had been designed to enforce control now turned against themselves. Nobody was winning. Everyone was losing. The only question was whether there'd be anything left worth controlling when the fractures finally reached their conclusion. The cameras kept rolling because someone had to document the collapse, and documentation was the only certainty remaining when power destroyed itself from within. The reconstruction crews arrived before the smoke cleared. They worked with practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd been called to repair damage from enhanced individual conflicts, wouldn't be the last. Insurance adjusters cataloged structural failures. City officials issued statements about resilience and recovery. The machinery of normalization engaged within hours, converting catastrophe into inconvenience. By the third day, most of the green geometric prisons had dissolved. Not all. Some remained flickering with that sickly luminescence containing spaces nobody could access, and which authorities had declared under ongoing investigation. The barriers didn't respond to commands, didn't acknowledge attempts at communication, just persisted autonomous remnants of a will that had briefly superseded its host before fragmenting into self-sustaining artifacts. Nobody knew if Power Ring was still conscious inside one of them, or if the entity that had worn that identity had been consumed entirely by the thing it had bonded with. The question remained academically interesting, but operationally irrelevant. The containment fields served their function regardless of whose will maintained them. Alman sat in an office that bore no nameplate, no official designation, housed in a building whose ownership traced through shell corporations that existed only in digital ledgers. The infrastructure he'd built continued operating with machine precision. Surveillance networks, feeding data to analysis algorithms, coordination protocols, distributing assignments to personnel who didn't question orders, systems that had been designed to function without requiring individual oversight. He reviewed reports showing enhanced individual activity declining by 43% over the past 72 hours. Not because Crime Syndicate had successfully suppressed resistance, but because potential resistors had internalized the cost-benefit analysis. Fight and become example. Comply and remain functional. The choice sold itself once people understood the mathematics. Ultraman's whereabouts were unknown. The last confirmed sighting placed him somewhere over the Atlantic, heading east at speeds that suggested departure rather than tactical repositioning. Whether he'd return or simply find new territory to dominate wasn't Alman's concern. The systems didn't require his physical presence anymore. They'd absorbed what he represented, inevitable force, backing institutional authority, and converted it into structural assumption. Superwoman appeared on morning talk shows explaining that recent turbulence represented growing pains in any significant organizational transition. Her delivery was warm, sympathetic, perfectly calibrated to make viewers feel informed rather than alarmed. The civil war between Crime Syndicate members was reframed as philosophical disagreement among allies, resolved through professional discourse, rather than the combat footage still circulating on social platforms. The contradiction didn't matter. People believed what made them comfortable, and comfort came from voices that sounded authoritative, while requesting nothing except passive acceptance. Johnny Quick's signature appeared sporadically broken windows forming patterns. Traffic accidents with velocities that suggested impossible causation graffiti that hadn't existed seconds before witnesses looked away. Not coordinated, not strategic, just evidence that entropy remained active, converting order into disorder for no purpose except proving it could. The city adapted. Insurance premiums increased for properties in high-velocity incident zones. Building codes were adjusted to account for kinetic damage from unidentified sources. Life continued with the understanding that some variables couldn't be controlled, only accounted for in actuarial tables. Marie Moreau sat in a recovery room that resembled hospital wards, except for the restraints built into furniture and the door that locked from outside. Annie had extracted her during the chaos at Godolkin, carried her through barriers that were already failing, deposited her in a location that claimed to be sanctuary, but which felt like different management of the same captivity. The medical staff were professional, gentle, explained procedures before implementing them. They drew blood for analysis, monitored her vitals, asked questions about her experiences with practiced neutrality that suggested they'd heard worse, and documented it with equal efficiency. Nobody explained who funded the facility or what happened to patients once they were deemed recovered. Marie didn't ask. She'd learned that questions only generated answers that made compliance seem reasonable. Through the window, she could see the city continuing its ordinary operations. People commuting to employment, businesses opening for commerce. The machinery of daily existence grinding forward, because stopping required coordination that chaos had disrupted. She wondered if Annie considered this rescue or just relocation. Wondered if the difference mattered when freedom had become relative concept, measured against immediate threats rather than absolute principles. The boys had relocated again, this time to a basement apartment in a building scheduled for demolition in 6 months, which meant inspectors had stopped caring about code violations. Water damage made the air smell like slow rot. Electrical outlets sparked occasionally, suggesting wiring that had given up trying to be safe. Butcher sat at the table that wobbled on uneven legs, staring at the empty space where the vial had been before he'd made the decision nobody else wanted responsibility for. He'd sealed it in a container designed to survive fires, floods, and most conventional attempts at forced entry, then buried it in a location known only to him, coordinates memorized rather than recorded. The virus existed. Knowing that changed everything, while changing nothing. Crime Syndicate adapted their operations accordingly, enhanced individual populations, segregated into manageable sectors, contingency protocols for biological threats, public health infrastructure that could pivot to quarantine measures under appropriate justification. The threat had been absorbed into planning documents, neutered through preparation. Reviewed news coverage on a device they'd modified to receive, but not broadcast. Watching how quickly the narrative shifted from crisis to recovery to normalcy. 3 weeks. That's how long it took for extraordinary violence to become historical footnote that people referenced in conversation but didn't actively fear. "We didn't stop anything," he said quietly, not quite accusation, not quite observation. "Just delayed it until they built around us. We're still here." Huey offered the statement, carrying less conviction than he'd intended. "That counts, does it? We're hiding in a building waiting to be torn down, monitoring a world that's already moved past caring about what we tried to do." Closed the device. Surviving isn't the same as winning when the thing you're surviving looks exactly like what you were fighting against. Butcher said nothing. He'd stopped pretending their resistance mattered in conventional terms. They existed in the gaps, the spaces where systems couldn't quite reach. Not because they were effective, but because they were small enough to be strategically irrelevant. Annie hadn't returned to the safe house. She'd sent a message through channels that changed daily, got her out. Don't follow. Whether she was protecting Marie from the boys, or protecting the boys from the consequences of harboring someone who'd been designated institutional property, nobody asked. The silence was its own answer. Cypher stood before a projected display, showing Project Odessa's latest iteration. The formula had been adjusted 17 times since Crime Syndicate's arrival. Each modification creating compound V derivatives that were incrementally different from baseline. Some enhanced strength, some modified perception. One variant induced profound compliance that the subjects interpreted as contentment. That one had entered production immediately. The students who'd been processed through the program emerged different, not broken, not obviously damaged, just calibrated to interpret authority as benevolence and structure as freedom. They'd test well in public opinion surveys, make excellent faces for enhanced integration initiatives, demonstrate that the system worked when people stopped resisting it. Godolphin University reopened for enrollment 6 weeks after the containment incident. Applications increased by 37%. Parents wanted their enhanced children somewhere safe, somewhere that promised structure during uncertain times. The facility's recent troubles were reframed as security testing proof that protocols worked under extreme stress. Nobody mentioned the students who disappeared during lockdown. Official records showed voluntary withdrawals, transfers to other programs, medical leaves that required privacy. The documentation was thorough, signed by appropriate authorities, filed in systems that made retrieval possible, but inquiry difficult. The world accepted the explanations because the alternative required confronting institutions that controlled the definitions of acceptable truth. Sister Sage had been offered a consulting position with a salary that suggested silence was expensive but affordable. She'd accepted. The alternative was unemployment followed by investigation into professional conduct results, predetermined career destroyed through mechanisms that looked like due process. She told herself consultation allowed her to influence from inside. The lie was comfortable enough to sleep with. Homelander remained the public face of enhanced security integration, appearing at events designed to reassure citizens that their protectors remained vigilant. His smile had been focus grouped to death. His statements were written by teams who understood that conviction mattered less than delivery. He knew what he'd become mascot for a system that had moved past requiring his genuine authority. But the alternative was irrelevance. And irrelevance was death for someone who'd built identity on being necessary. So he smiled, said his lines, pretended the cameras made him real instead of rendering him translucent. The evening news led with economic recovery statistics. Enhanced individual incidents were down. Public confidence was trending positive. Several major corporations announced expansion plans citing improved stability and regulatory clarity. An analyst explained that recent turbulence had actually strengthened institutional resilience by stress testing systems under extreme conditions. The conclusion was optimistic. The worst was over. Adjustments had been made. Normalcy was achievable for those willing to adapt. In homes across the country, people watched and felt relieved. Not because the threat had been eliminated, but because they'd been given permission to stop being afraid. Permission from authorities who sounded confident and whose confidence was more palatable than sustained vigilance. The broadcast continued. Weather forecasts, sports scores, a human interest story about a community rebuilding after enhanced individual conflict destroyed infrastructure. The segment emphasized resilience, cooperation, the triumph of ordinary people over extraordinary circumstance. Nobody interviewed the families who'd lost members during the fighting. Those stories didn't test well with audiences who wanted comfort rather than confrontation. Butcher stood outside the building that housed their temporary shelter. Smoking a cigarette he'd found in an abandoned coat pocket, watching traffic move with ordinary rhythms that suggested nothing apocalyptic had recently occurred. The city had metabolized its trauma and converted it into scar tissue, still there, just incorporated into the body's new normal. He thought about the vial buried in ground that would eventually be developed into something commercial, something profitable, something that erased evidence beneath progress. The virus existed as potential, and potential was meaningless without intent to deploy. Maybe that's all resistance ever was, potential that people held on to, because acting meant accepting consequences that survival couldn't afford. MM joined him in the doorway, not speaking, just sharing the space and the cigarette when Butcher offered it. "You think it mattered?" MM asked eventually. "Any of it." Butcher was quiet long enough that the question seemed rhetorical. Then, "Don't know. But asking means we haven't forgotten what mattered was supposed to feel like." It wasn't comfort, wasn't victory, just acknowledgement that the world had changed and they'd survived long enough to witness the aftermath without becoming part of it. Inside, Huey was preparing food that would stretch across meals they couldn't predict. The routine of survival cooking, cleaning, maintaining the minimum necessary to continue existing, not living, just not dying yet. Somewhere in the city, Power Ring's autonomous barriers still flickered. Superwoman was preparing for her next public appearance. Owlman was reviewing efficiency reports that showed systems optimizing beyond their original parameters. Johnny Quick was creating microcosms of beautiful destruction that served no purpose except refusing order. The virus remained buried. Crime Syndicate remained operational. The boys remained alive. And the world kept turning because turning was what worlds did. Regardless of who controlled the mechanism, or whether control was illusion maintained through collective agreement to believe the story authorities told. The cameras had stopped rolling. The crisis had become history. The next headline was already being written. Nothing had ended. Things had just stopped being acute and started being chronic. That was how occupation worked when it was done properly. Not through conquest that announced itself, but through normalization that made people forget conquest had occurred. The boys would continue resisting, because stopping meant admitting there was nothing left worth protecting. Crime Syndicate would continue optimizing, because that's what systems did when nobody remained capable of shutting them down. Between those two positions sat a world that had learned to live with both accepting violence as variance and control as comfort. because the alternative required energy that exhaustion had long since depleted. The story didn't end. It just stopped being told, which was close enough to ending for people who needed to believe in conclusions. The only truth remaining was the one nobody wanted to acknowledge. The world had gotten exactly what it deserved, and deserving, it didn't make it easier to survive. And that's a wrap. Talk about a bad ending. We didn't get a big final battle. We just got Monday morning. The scariest part of this whole story isn't the lasers or the monsters. It's how quickly everyone just said, "Okay, I guess we live in a dictatorship now," and went back to work. Owlman basically beat humanity by being a really good office manager. He realized that if you make the trains run on time, people don't care if you're a supervillain. That is dark. Also, Ultraman rage quitting the country because the game was too easy, classic toxic gamer behavior. The saddest part is Homelander. He's still standing there, smiling completely dead inside, basically just an NPC in his own game. And Godolkin enrollment going up. That proves branding is stronger than survival instincts. Parents are literally signing waivers to send their kids to the torture factory because the brochure looked nice. The boys rotting in a basement feels real, though. Butcher holding the virus and deciding not to use it is the ultimate defeat. He realized you can't save a world that wants to be owned. We traded freedom for same-day shipping and safety. 0 out of 10 stars for the world would not recommend living here. So we basically watched the world end, but it was really boring. The crime syndicate speedran conquering Earth, not with lasers, but with terms and conditions agreements. Owlman looked at Vought's evil plan and said, "It's free real estate." The biggest L goes to Homelander. He spent years acting like a god only to get told to sit down by a guy who wears his underwear on the outside. He entered his flop era hard. He's basically an unpaid intern in his own tower now. Butcher almost raged quit the server with that virus. He was ready to delete everyone, but realized the game was already over. The scariest part is that the regular people just accepted it. We traded freedom for Amazon Prime shipping and safety. We didn't lose a war. We just signed a new user agreement and forgot to read the fine print. Final score 0 out of 10 for humanity's survival skills, but 10 out of 10 for the drama. We didn't lose because the villains were stronger. We lost because their customer service was better.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss out future videos. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.